Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Davenant Hall Fellows Lecture. My name is Michael Riggins. I'm the assistant editor of Ad Fontes. Most of you, if you're here or if you're watching this recording, you probably already know something about the Davenant Institute, but in case you don't, the Davenant Institute is an organization that is dedicated to renewing the riches of classical Protestant wisdom for the contemporary church. And we do this in a multitude of ways through our publishing endeavors of scholarly books in our journal Ad Fontes. We do this through our annual and regional conviviums. We do this through Davenant Hall. And we do this through the Davenant House Study Center that we run. This, of course, being a Davenant Hall event, Davenant Hall is dedicated to restoring the medieval university and the early modern republic of letters for today's digital age. And so we bring in world-class faculty to teach classes on theology, biblical studies, literature, philosophy, and so these lectures are a monthly endeavor to showcase some of the world-class faculty that we have. So tonight's lecturer is Dr. Jason Lepojärvi. He is C.S. Lewis Associate Professor, of Theology and Literature at George Fox University, a former Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Thorneloe University, President of the Oxford University C.S. Lewis Society, and Junior Research Fellow in Theology at St. Benet's Hall in Oxford. Lepojärvi serves as the managing editor of Zenzoot, the C.S. Lewis journal, and is regularly invited to speak internationally on the Inklings, for example, in Brazil, England, Canada, the USA, Germany, Denmark, Finland, and Spain. His scholarly publications on theology, philosophy, ethics, literature, and politics have appeared in the Harvard Theological Review, Religious Studies, and Politics and Religion, among other journals. He lives in Oregon with his wife, Isa, and their 3 small children.
Thank you, Michael. Perfect pronunciation of my name, by the way. For those of you who don't know, it's a hybrid of Finnish, Laplandic, and British Columbian Canadian roots. My mother is from Canada and my father from Finland originally. Thanks for sharing that handout in the chat, which consists mostly of kind of key quotations. So if you find it helpful, do follow along. The subject I want to talk about today, I've titled C.S. Lewis and the Personal Opinion Fallacy. What is all that about? I will tell you. Not many readers of C.S. Lewis's fiction, like the Chronicles of Narnia. Davenant Hall has a class on discovering Narnia. Not many readers of his apologetics, like The Abolition of Man or Mere Christianity, know about this literary disagreement C.S. Lewis had with a fellow scholar of English literature that took place over the course of 3 years in the mid-1930s, and which was then published by Oxford University Press as a co-authored book called The Personal Heresy, a Controversy. And I have a copy of it here. The Personal Heresy, a Controversy, published in 1939. At the time of this fascinating literary dispute, C.S. Lewis was a Fellow of English at Magdalen College, Oxford, and E.M.W. Tillyard, 10 years Lewis's senior, was a Fellow of English Literature at Jesus College in Cambridge. So anyone who knows anything about higher education in England would surmise that a lot was at stake in this controversy. But in truth, this so-called controversy is somewhat a misnomer, an untypical British overstatement. Both men, you see, they conducted themselves with charm and thoroughness, taking turns, providing letters, 3 apiece. And halfway through the dispute, in his second response to Tillyard, Lewis disarms his opponent by invoking a common enemy I have little fear that you will misunderstand me. We have both learned our dialectic in the rough academic arena, where knocks that would frighten the London literary coteries are given and taken in good part. When some 20 years later, Lewis accepted the newly found chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalen College in Cambridge, Tillyard, by then the master of Jesus College, had been one of Lewis's 6 electors. Tolkien had been another. So regardless of who won this dispute or controversy, evidently neither was very hurt by the so-called knocks. The name of the heresy, or the fallacy, we can use these two interchangeably, heresy and fallacy, was first coined by Lewis in his opening letter to Tillyard, which ends dramatically with an invitation to be free of the personal heresy. What was the disagreement about, and what is the personal heresy? Well, in Lewis's words, the personal heresy is the proposition, which he has taken from Tillyard, that all poetry is about the poet's state of mind. Or, as he says elsewhere, that the assumption that the writer's psychological state always flows unimpeded and undisguised into the product. This is the personal heresy, according to Lewis, and he calls it a serious error. Without going into details of Lewis's many objections to this proposition or assumption, his objections did have an impact on Tillyard, who writes that Lewis's probings reveal what was unsound and helped me to mend my thoughts. But Tillyard continues to attempt to defend his view by refining the meaning of what he means by personality more carefully. But this is met by Lewis's accusation that Tillyard is just begging the question. Whether or not the poet's personality, whether we're talking about the poet's personality or his state of mind or the mental patterns or the feeling that the product supposedly reveals, begs the question of whether genuinely poetry or creative writing is really about that, whatever that is. At several points in their disagreement, Tillyard, he uses these extravagant superlatives to describe the profession of poetry. He says stuff like, the great poet is a superior person, and he unfavorably contrasts him with the ordinary man. Lewis objects to this, what he calls false exaltation of poetry, or poetolatry, as he calls it elsewhere, from the idolatry of poets. He says, one of my chief grievances against the personal heresy and its inevitable attendant poetolatry is the disparagement of common things and common man which they induce. So elitism is bad, but the denigration of the ordinary is worse. That's the real problem. And Lewis bemoans what he calls the arrogance of poets, and he lets loose in the Personal Heresy. He writes, courtesy to our contemporaries mustn't forbid us to point out that a poet, an admitted and unmistakable poet, is sometimes, in certain periods, often a man inferior to the majority in tenderness, enthusiasm, and knowledge of nature, human nature. These are Tillyard's descriptions of the great poet. Not to speak of information, common sense, fortitude, and courtesy. Wash their feet, and I will praise your humility. Sit at their feet, and you will be a fool. If anyone ever wondered why Lewis never got that professorship in poetry that he applied for at Oxford, here might be a clue. Most scholars, but not all, score the disagreement in Lewis's favor. You may judge it for yourself if you do and read this book. Mark Neal and Jerry Root from Wheaton College, for example, say that the main problem with the Personal Heresy is that it takes the reader's attention away from the text itself on the author, to focus on the author. Now here we could distinguish, and we must distinguish, between two kinds of literature, however porously. Explicitly, Lewis and Tillyard are talking about poetry. They're basing their arguments on mostly poetry. But it's clear that they believe that the disagreement is about much more than simply this. It's about all imaginative literature, as Lewis calls it. That is, quote, about poetry, drama, and the novel. For our purposes, we may call this kind or this form of writing imaginative literature. In Lewis's mind, imaginative literature includes fiction, poems, plays, stories, or whatnot. In the Personal Heresy, Lewis explains that, in the book Personal Heresy, Lewis explains that the most characteristic contents of such literary utterances are stories, accounts of events that did not take place. In his essay on stories, which is basically the seed that would later grow into his book An Experiment in Criticism, Lewis distinguishes between the fairy tale and the realistic novel, but both belong, he says, to the same genus of imaginative literature. This type of literature, he thinks, is not valuable for any impressions of the writer's personality, however we want to define personality. But the second type or form of literature is different. This type of literature is more valuable for such purposes and beyond. This is what Lewis calls truly personal writings, and we may call them biographical literature, in contrast to imaginative literature. What then does biographical literature consist of? We might agree with Lewis that, quote, private letters are obviously in this class, and many essays, as he writes in the book, The Personal Heresy. In short, everything that falls under what Lewis calls historical data. Of course, there are borderline cases, as Lewis admits, between imaginative literature and biographical literature. But this shouldn't trouble us. The border of hill and dale is not easily categorized and is perhaps an oxymoron, as in Hillsdale College, but the categories of hill and dale, they remain distinct and comprehensible. And so upon closer inspection, some hills might turn out to be mole hills and some personal histories imaginative fabrications, or vice versa. And when this happens, when there's doubt about which is which, the solution, Lewis says in An Experiment in Criticism, is not the total abandonment of either type of literature, but, quote, to seek information from more reliable sources. And I will say more about this approach very soon. With these preliminary thoughts in place, we can now begin to define the outlines of a related but distinct form of misreading that is the main theme of my talk today. Lewis goes a long way towards describing this form of misreading in many of his sources, but he never names it or defines it. I like to call it the personal opinion fallacy. What Lewis and Tillyard had called the personal heresy, and what I call the personal opinion fallacy, I propose, are two species of the same genus, which could be called the autobiographical fallacies. So personal opinion fallacy and personal heresy are the species of the same genus, which could be called the autobiographical fallacies. And these are forms of misreading that treat fiction as sources of knowledge in a wrong or incomplete way. They confuse life with art in some manner. The Personal Heresy uses imaginative literature primarily as raw material for clues to the author's personality. And perhaps it should have been called the Personality Heresy to make this clear. An example of this is when Lewis speaks of the assumed and usually concealed major premise that the cynicism or disillusionment put into the mouths of some Shakespearean characters are Shakespeare's own. Cynicism is a personality trait. Personality traits combined a personality make. Lewis says, it is sometimes asked whether Shakespeare was like this or that character in his plays. And he replies, I do not know the answer. Why not? We will get to this. So that's the personal opinion, the personal heresy, whereas the personal opinion fallacy concerns specifically the author's opinions, not their personality or their mental pattern or their emotions or the like. This is a parallel form of misreading, of gleaning biography from fiction in a somewhat deficient way. And in its crudest form, just to make my point clear, in its crudest form, the personal opinion fallacy says in effect, because the story's character says this or that, or because the plot or the atmosphere or passage suggests to me as a reader this or that, the author must personally think this or that too. This is a disastrous interpretative premise that can't lead to valuable conclusions except by chance. And yet readers, even critics, commit it all the time, including, I'm afraid, myself, when I drop my guard. There are, of course, other closely related heresies and fallacies that belong to the same family of misreadings. What, for example, should we call the assumption that because a given character in a story is bad or evil, the inventor of that character must personally dislike the subset, the group of people the character supposedly represents in the story, be they women or men, black or white, gay or sad, or whatever. Perhaps we might call it the argument from dislike. It's, of course, an equally silly but common form of misreading. Fiction as a subset of imaginative literature is particularly vulnerable to the personal opinion fallacy by its very nature. And this is because, as Lewis says, most of the imaginative literature in the world is storytelling. And as we all know, storytelling includes a lot of dialogue. That is, the exchange of literary utterances, including opinions. So no wonder we, as readers, are often drawn to consider these opinions. Fiction is also vulnerable to the personal opinion fallacy because fiction is a mix of information, misinformation, and disinformation, or truth, mistakes, and lies. Lewis confessed to having himself learned from novels in particular a great deal of information, but also, he says, plenty of misinformation. Lewis's own fiction is especially vulnerable. Much of his writing, whether it's on criticism, on theology, or apologetics, or fiction alike, as one of his former students has said, his writing emerged from his pen not as distinct categories or genres, but as themselves mixed genres. And this is not a complaint. On the contrary, this speaks to what Lewis's friend O.M. Barfield has called Lewis's presence of mind, by which he meant that quote, somehow what Lewis thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything. This quality, said Barfield, transcended all diversities of topic. What, for example, is the theme of Lewis's Till We Have Faces, for those of you who have read it? To me, a dozen suitable candidates, thematic candidates, come to mind. And if I was a betting man and I had to put my money on just one theme, I would probably place my money on love as the theme. But what's the theme of the cosmic trilogy? Is it perhaps science? Is it lust for power? Is it morality? Is it gender, perhaps? The genres and the themes mix in Lewis's writing. And what Barfield had called Lewis's presence of mind and his evocative writing, they kind of seduce the reader to treat everything as equally valuable source material for personal exploration, but at the expense of a legion of possible misreadings and misunderstandings. In Lewis's books, continued this same former student of his, perceptions jostle against each other and are so interconnected that it is almost impossible to separate one strand from the next. The Jesuit philosopher Martin Darcy, a contemporary of Lewis at Oxford, said that so absorbing is Lewis's prose sometimes that, quote, one's critical faculties are lulled to sleep. The themes or strands of Lewis's fiction especially are numerous, they're interconnected, compound, organic, overlapping, diffusive. Choose your metaphor. As readers of imaginative literature, why should we avoid personal opinion fallacy? Why should we care in the first place? Why bother at all? Well, the first obvious reason is that when authors become targets of critics who mistake the views expressed in their characters or their plot or atmosphere for the views held by the authors themselves, for their real life views, many authors begin censoring themselves. And this sort of authorial self-censorship leads to reducing diversity of expression and dilutes vigor of expression. And this is a serious malady. Besides authorial self-censorship, another obvious but perhaps tautologous reason to avoid this fallacy is that too often we end up falsely attributing to authors opinions that they perhaps did not in reality share. And this is an injustice, even if these opinions are good, politically correct ones, but especially if they're not. And indeed, which is interesting, it's important to recognize that both prejudice and favoritism, so negative and positive prejudice, make us susceptible to this personal opinion fallacy. In Lewis's essay, which was unfinished, and it's largely unknown today, called On Criticism, it's a fascinating essay and is immensely relevant because it concerns good and bad forms of reading imaginative works specifically. But in this essay, Lewis speaks for all writers when he says that you can be blamed and praised for saying what you never said and for not saying what you have said. Undeserved approval, he says, is also a critical fault just as much as undeserved blame, both being critical vices, as he puts it. Negative interpretations, he says, are, of course, particularly dangerous for the lazy or hurried reviewer. But apparently, laudatory critics often show an equal ignorance of text. As exegesis, both are equally wrong, he thinks. And we may ask Lewis that surely, though he makes a point, surely negative misreadings are morally worse than positive misreadings. So attributing like negative opinions to an author falsely is morally worse than attributing or praising an author for positive merits that aren't warranted by the text. It's interesting that Lewis seems to disagree with this. He suggests that, quote, fatuous praise from a manifest fool may hurt more than any deprecation. And I'm reminded, for example, of his response in a private letter to one of the very few entirely positive reviews of his book, The Four Loves, which was penned by an Anglican clergyman. In this private letter, Lewis sighed to a friend that it's a prime example of the favorable review which exasperates an author much more than the most spiteful censure could do. He misunderstands so deeply. I find this amusing, but I suspect that it's slightly hyperbolic. Certainly as a rule, I think it's very doubtful. I'd say that rather negative misreadings are on average morally more problematic because of their possible ill effects. The ill effects on ordinary mortal authors' feelings. Perhaps Lewis had very strong rhino skin, but ill effects on ordinary authors' feelings and their reputations and even their livelihoods. I mean, praise culture isn't a serious malady today. Cancel culture is. But it's also a problem, the fallacy is also a problem for the critics or the canceller's own heart, because it's better to err in charity. We should avoid the personal opinion fallacy because we care about justice. We want to be good people. But we also want to be good readers. No true lover of fiction often commits this fallacy. When we do commit it, it's as likely to reveal something about us as it is about the writer. And we may betray our own prejudices and biases, which we then project onto others. Fiction is further vulnerable because, as Lewis says in a book, to a determined critic, almost everything can be a symbol or an irony or an ambiguity, open to the most fantastical interpretations. Thus, he says, increasingly we meet only ourselves in our supposed criticism. This misreading is important because it interferes with our ability to judge and appreciate the literary work in and of itself, and even because it moves us away from enjoying and the enjoyment and literary analysis into something like half-baked psychoanalysis. It damages or ruins the imaginative and moral imagination. Finally, and I could come up with other reasons to avoid this fallacy, but I'll finish with this. The personal opinion fallacy is also a colossal disfavor to scholarship, a colossal loss of scholarly academic attention and energy. And if it's left unchecked, if the false trails that are laid are left unchecked, it may take generations to correct them. And in literary criticism, as Lewis says, ideas still circulate from one critic to another, which have obviously not been verified by actual reading. This, of course, applies to all disciplines, theology included. When these ideas are damaging, when we correct them, the correction to the corrected critic or their admirers might feel like we're being defensive or partisan when we're not. Okay, so much for what the personal opinion fallacy is, and for some reasons why we should try to avoid it, both as readers and as Christians. I'll next turn to how we can avoid it. Hints about the correction to the personal opinion fallacy, the literary antibody to the virus, have been dropped throughout these reflections, but it helps to spell it out and perhaps give it a name. You remember the question about whether Shakespeare was like this or that of his characters, and Lewis said he did not know the answer. Why not? Because, he explained, to decide that question, we must start with investigating historical data and moral principles. In other words, we must turn from imaginative literature to biographical literature, and in this case, to ethics as well. We must ground our biographical speculations in biographical literature. Let history tether theory. The principle of biographical verification, as I like to call it, and as I've put in the handout, and perhaps you can help me think of a sexier name, the principle of biographical verification is a humiliatingly effective curative or corrective to the personal opinion fallacy. But it's also a corrective to other forms of bad reading. What I mean by it is this, and an analogy might help to explain both the problem of the fallacy and the corrective principle. Imagine a black and white painting, which represents an imaginative literary artifact, such as a book of fiction. In this black and white painting, you see several hearts, or whatever shapes, which are in black and white, one or the other. The other color, black or white, represents the opinions expressed or suggested by the characters, the plot, or the atmosphere of that work, but which the author does not personally ascribe to. Now, and the other color then reflects the opinions, the real life opinions of the author. Now, if I were to ask you, which is which? So what does black correspond to, and what does white correspond to? You couldn't give me an answer, could you? And why not? The reason is you lack contrast. You lack a backdrop against which to evaluate and compare and contrast the content. In short, you lack what we called biographical literature. You have this imaginative artifact, this painting, but you need to set it against biographical literature, say the wall in this metaphor analogy. Once you do your homework, once you read essays, letters, memoirs, and so on, everything that fell under so-called historical data, in the analogy represented by the wall, which is either black or white, on which this artifact hangs, you'll be in a much better position to sift through the personal and the fictional and avoid the personal opinion fallacy, because you'll know what color the biographical opinions, the real life opinions are, and you can spot it more easily in the work of creative, imaginative work of fiction. You might even start seeing some shades of gray. Want to know what theory of atonement Lewis ascribed to personally, if any? Well, I'd say put down your copy of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, especially or despite Aslan's sacrifice there, and pick up Mere Christianity, or pick up an overpriced copy of his personal letters. I have them over there. Want to know how Lewis felt about teenage girls, about budding female sexuality? For goodness sake, put down The Last Battle, especially despite Susan, and read his pre-conversion diary, All My Road Before Me, for his younger, immature view, or read his later biographical writings for his more mature Christian view, or read memoirs of Lewis by women who knew him. And then you may return to his fiction with renewed zeal, but you're immunized against reading too much into it. Almost absurdly, Tillyard, you remember Lewis's interlocutor, recognizes the merits of what I've called the personal biographical verification, the principle of biographical verification, although he doesn't name it. But he thinks that This principle is a form of cheating. Biography, he admits, may substantially help our understanding of the mental pattern as revealed in the poet's art. But Tillyard likens the mixture of biography and criticism, as he calls it, to looking up the answer to a problem when tired of trying to solve it. And Lewis's proposal, he thinks, is actually the critic's besetting sin, which is better avoided. Biography is an illegitimate shortcut. Far from cheating, I think it's the most basic, the most wise, and necessary work we must do if we are to be good readers, let alone good critics. Sometimes, of course, even the principle of biographical verification will yield no definitive answer. And when that happens, we may, of course, speculate and conjecture, but we must be honest. Again, Lewis offers a really helpful supporting principle. If I hazard a conjecture, he writes, it must be with full knowledge and with a clear warning to my reader that it is a long shot, far more likely to be wrong than right. Especially, I would add, if the writer or the artist is dead and not around to refute us and defend themselves. But even if they are, this is also what erring in charity looks like. Critical judgment is difficult for both the trained and the untrained reader. This should instill us in us humility and moderation. Two American Lewis scholars write, how can we be confident that we have understood the motives and intentions of others? This is a great question. And Charles Williams, Lewis's friend, who made a living by reviewing books, many of them terrible, at a pace faster than I read them, wrote, not one mind in 1,000 can be trusted to state accurately what its opponent says, much less what he thinks. The more significant or sensitive the questions or values being speculated about, the more unwise forgetting this guiding principle is. A responsible reader or scholar would not too hastily draw conclusions about any author's views on, say, sex or race or religion and so on. But to speculate about their favorite color or their favorite animal or so on is much less dubious. It's precisely when serious allegations are made that the standards of probity should rise, not fall. Otherwise, we risk becoming these tedious modern-day heresy hunters of the latest taboo or sin. We're so eager to catch authors of fiction off guard that we only drop our own. A perfect example of this is J.K. Rowling's book, which was accused of transphobia based on the fact that she used this very well-tried trope of a murderer posing as a woman to lull his victims. Another good example of this is an author who cites the exchange in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader between Caspian and Lucy about girls who squint and have freckles as an example of what this author calls Lewis's smug and snide disparagement of girls. And this critic not only falls into the trap of equating characters' views with authorial views, the personal opinion fallacy, but he also mistakenly extrapolates from the particular to the general. He'd benefit from reading Lewis's letter to a young boy, Lawrence Krieg, from October 1955. He says, I don't dislike panthers at all. I think they are one of the loveliest animals there are. I don't remember that I have put any bad panthers in the books. There are some good ones fighting against Rabbit Ash in The Horse and His Boy, aren't they? And even if I had, that wouldn't mean that I thought all panthers bad, any more than I think all men bad because of Uncle Andrew, or all boys bad because Edmund was once a traitor. So I began these reflections with a brief overview of the personal heresy between Lewis and Tillyard. And I proposed a loose distinction between imaginative literature and biographical literature. I then introduced a related but distinct form of literary misreading, which I called the personal opinion fallacy. And I discussed reasons why fiction in particular might be vulnerable to this fallacy. And I also suggested some reasons why we as readers of fiction, and just as decent human beings and Christians, might want to try to avoid it. The principle of biographical verification helps steer the responsible reader away from seeing too much in literary works of imagination. And before I conclude this talk, I would like to guard you against some possible misunderstandings of my argument. I'm saying a lot of things, but there are some things I'm not saying, and I want to guard you against these misunderstandings. The potential for misunderstanding is endless, but I mention only 3 ideas that you may or may not entertain. First of all, I'm not saying that imaginative literature, let alone Lewis's fiction, is free from personal opinions. On the contrary, it's often replete with them. Even in the Personal Heresy, the book, Lewis acknowledged that sometimes authors even deliberately cloak their opinions, put on the disguise of verse, as he says. Certainly something of the author's personality and opinions may be in evidence in their creations. I doubt anyone would question this. In Lewis's short piece published in the New York Times, "Sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said," Lewis admits that part of his motive or intention in writing the Chronicles of Narnia, for example, was to smuggle in theology, or more precisely, the taste or the potency of the reality behind theology, behind Christian doctrines that had, in his view, gone flat and insipid, like the teaching on forgiveness. My claim, my argument today is not that writers never try to educate or influence their readers. Of course they do. Secondly, I entertain no assumption that interpreting so-called biographical literature is always straightforward or unproblematic either. It's not. Biography has to be read carefully as well. That is, not always at face value. And this is for several reasons. Authors misremember things, they change their mind, they dramatize, they conceal, they even lie. And Lewis was well aware of this aspect of biographical writing. One Lewis scholar says that Lewis's spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, carried self-dramatization far beyond ordinary license, and that Lewis wonderfully mythicized his memory of his life. Alistair McGrath, the theologian, has said basically the same in one of his essays, The Enigma of Autobiography, Critical Reflections on Surprised by Joy. If reading in general is difficult, so is introspection, and so is retrospection. We make mistakes, even as autobiographers. But this problem belongs to a different set of literary problems. This wasn't the subject of my talk today. So then thirdly and finally, I'm not saying that psychological theories are unhelpful in interpreting an author's life or their letters. There are several decent examples of good, more careful and responsible ways to glean biography from fiction, or should I say, in conjunction with fiction, back and forth between imaginative and biographical literature with measured analysis of both. Even if nothing in the biographical literature explicitly demonstrates or supports what we see or we think we have seen in fiction, we might just possibly be right, however improbable. But proving that we are right is quite another matter, and it's full of dangers. Lewis's essay, Psychoanalysis and Literary Criticism, is essentially an examination of these dangers. Another great example, or a great example of good psychological interpretations, is the Lewis scholar and professional psychologist, psychiatrist, Stephen Logan's essay, The Soul of C.S. Lewis, which was published in C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner. And I mention it because it's so daring and yet so responsible. And it so well illustrates some of the things that we've been talking about. You see, Logan, he proposes a theory that can't be evaluated on the present historical data. And the theory is this, that Lewis may have found his relationship with his mother disappointing to him, but that Lewis possibly remained unconscious of this. Did he feel securely and lovingly held by his mother? Logan asks. Was he welcomed into the world? Great questions, I think. But how on earth would we even begin to evaluate them? Even Logan, who is a professional psychiatrist, as I said, sends us, the reader, to biography. He says, we would need to know a lot more about Flora Hamilton, Lewis's mother, and her feelings towards her son, in order to be able even to speculate with any confidence. This is maturity. And I will end with this, because J.R. Tolkien, in my view, exhibits a similar maturity. For the Tolkien fans out there, I'll go out with a Tolkien quote. After his wife Edith's death, Tolkien wrote a beautiful letter to his son Christopher. Christopher had asked about the inscription Tolkien had chosen for Edith's tombstone, Luthien, the name of the central heroine in Tolkien's invented mythology. Tolkien explains to his son in this letter, your mother was, and she knew she was, my Luthien. I will say no more now, but I should like ere long to have a long talk with you. For if, as seems probable, I shall never write any ordered biography, it is against my nature, which expresses itself about things deepest felt in tales and myths. Someone close in heart to me should know something about things that records do not record. I love that records do not record. Tolkien's tales and myths are pregnant, they're full, so to speak, with things deepest felt, as he called it. But to safeguard real history and to avoid future misunderstanding, what does he say? He says he wants to talk with his son so that more biographical records might record what was imaginatively recorded in myth and tale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lepojärvi, for that wonderful lecture. We're going to take about a 3 or 4 minute break to let Dr. Lepojärvi get a chance to catch his breath and to give you all time to think of some questions. So we have a Q&A feature down at the bottom. Please submit all of your questions through there, and then we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. So the first question is, what impact, if any, do you think Lewis's and Tillyard's debate had on later 20th century scholarship that swung in the opposite direction, like Barth's Death of the Author, in which people have just tried to remove the author altogether from interpreting a literary work.
I think it had a huge impact, together with Wimsatt and Beardsley, who were contemporaries in the United States, who wrote the seminal essay called the Intentional Fallacy from 1946, which opens with a direct reference to this dispute or controversy between Tillyard and Lewis, which signals that the fallacy that they want to talk about is directly inspired by and relevant to the Personal Heresy. But there were others as well, but I'd say that historically, Lewis's position won in mid-20th century and late 20th century literary criticism. I believe they call it the New Critics, the death of the author movement. So Lewis definitely had a role to play in this. I wouldn't go as far as to say that Lewis wanted the author dead. He himself, as a literary critic, distinguishes between the personal opinions of the authors of imaginative works and the opinions that expressed in those works which aren't ascribed to by the author. So he doesn't want the author dead completely, but he's cautioning against irresponsible ways of gleaning biography from fiction. And the book that I'm thinking of in particular is Lewis's preface to John Milton's Paradise Lost. There's one chapter, I think chapter 9 especially, that is very conscious of, okay, what does the Paradise Lost suggest? And is this actually Milton's own view or not? And he makes very nuanced distinctions between authorial views and imaginative views.
Could you talk a little bit about how these views that you're discussing shape your own role as a critic, especially in regards to Lewis's own works like The Great Divorce? How does trying to keep this in mind shape how you read that book, among his others?
Good question. It keeps me on my toes. It keeps me on my guard. I hope it's made me a better reader, I believe, a more responsible critic and interpreter. And I've had to reevaluate some of my assumptions about Lewis's fiction, The Great Divorce, Till We Have Faces, Screwtape Letters. The Great Divorce in particular is a great case study. Less than 2 weeks ago, at Magdalen College in Oxford, I was at a conference called Developing a Christian Mind, organized by the Oxford Pastorate. And in the humanities stream, I shared a talk similar to this one, and I introduced the Personal Opinion Fallacy and its corrective, the principle of biographical verification. And this talk was followed up by a workshop. I was tag teaming with Professor Simon Horrobin, who is the professor of English at Magdalen College, basically Lewis's successor, not immediate successor, of course, but the two of us led a workshop. The participants had read The Great Divorce, or crucial parts of it, in preparation, and we tried to practice applying these, avoiding this fallacy and being mindful of the danger of the fallacy to our reading of The Great Divorce. And it was so fascinating. The discussion was absolutely fascinating because it's so complicated. How do you interpret that book? In the preface, Lewis says that the last thing he wants to do is rouse factual curiosity about the details of the afterlife. And yet the book arouses factual curiosity about the details of the afterlife. And anyone who knows Lewis's real life opinions about purgatory and hell and heaven can spot these views expressed in the book. But sometimes these views aren't expressed through Lewis, the character. Lewis writes himself into this story, which is actually a dream. Again, complicates interpretation quite a bit. But sometimes Lewis, the character in the story, does not reflect the mature Lewis's views. Rather, it's George MacDonald who plays Dante's Virgil in this spiritual journey. MacDonald is the one who corrects the Lewis of the story. And it's more MacDonald whose views expressed in The Great Divorce reflect Lewis's authorial views. And what just complicates it even further is that some of these views aren't actually ascribed by the real George MacDonald, and this is acknowledged in the book. George MacDonald, by all accounts, was a universalist, and yet the George MacDonald in The Great Divorce is almost second-guessing or correcting his universalism. He has 20/20 hindsight. He has an eternal perspective, and so he has had time to think of his opinions from the eternal perspective. And it sounds like he may have modified them, perhaps. And so it's just a perfect case study in the worst possible sense. I mean, if you get my meaning, for testing the principle and the fallacy. You could do the same with Till We Have Faces, not surprised by joy, but Screwtape Letters, the Chronicles of Narnia, the Cosmic Trilogy, and so on.
Let's see. Could you talk a little bit more about some practical ways that Christians can be both charitable and discerning readers? And sort of walk this line between not reading too much into the personal views of the author and yet still exercise discernment in one's reading.
Well, I could give this whole talk again. It's quite basic, but it's hard to do. It's to treat works of fiction as works of fiction and try to enter the story, not read too much into it, to err on the side of charity whenever possible, especially when you're tempted to ascribe negative or politically incorrect opinions or ideas to the author. As standards of probity should rise, the more sensitive and combustive the questions are. And then just back things up. If you want to treat works of fiction as biography, and perhaps you should not primarily do that, you should treat them as works of fiction and just enjoy them. But if you do want to treat them as reflections of the author's personality or opinions, to be responsible and careful and turn to what Lewis called historical data to make sure that you're not reading too much into it. To make sure that you see the wall, to use the analogy, that you take a few steps so you see the wall around the literary artifact hanging from the wall, and so you have some contrast and perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. Someone is curious, how did you become a Lewis scholar?
By accident, Michael. I wasn't trained a Narnian, which is to say that I didn't read the Chronicles of Narnia until I was in my 20s. But in the military, all Finns spend a year or close to a year in the military, all Finnish males. We share a long border with a whimsical neighbor. I had time to read, and I accidentally picked up Lewis's The Problem of Pain, and I just fell in love with his style and the content, and he was instrumental in helping me overcome intellectual hurdles to the faith, as I later learned has happened to so many other people who either are helped to the faith or are helped to remain in the faith through the aid of Lewis's writings. And later on, when I came time to decide my dissertation topic, I thought I'd turn this personal passion into an academic study. I had never seriously studied Lewis as an academic or from a scholarly point of view. I had just enjoyed him, and I chose a pretty good horse, C.S. Lewis and love, because everyone seems to be interested in both C.S. Lewis and love. And my dissertation, God is love and God is love, but love is not God, essays on Lewis's theology of love, led to a number of speaking engagements and speaking invitations. And I am on this journey still, most recently appointed the C.S. Lewis Associate Professor. So I find that very appropriate in hindsight. I had no idea that you could turn it into a career, but here I am. Somebody has to do it.
Let's see. Are there any more questions from the audience? And Dr. Lepojärvi, do you have any final thoughts for us? Anything that you wanted to say more about that you weren't given the opportunity to?
I've given my piece. It's a read Lewis, enjoy his imaginative creations, especially the cosmic trilogy. I predict we will experience an imminent resurrection of that trilogy, a resurge of interest in that rather prophetic trilogy. And yeah.
That's interesting. Could you say a little bit more about why you expect to see such a resurgence? It seems like Narnia has been the popular book for the last 60 or 70 years. Why do you think that one is going to see renewed interest?
Well, on average, usually successful creative works have a better chance of surviving in history for centuries. Very few philosophical treatises in comparison survive. Out of Lewis's genre, his versatile literary output, Narnia will be long-lasting. But another creative piece that I think will be read in maybe, I don't know, 100 years time, but at least fit for the next 2 generations is the cosmic trilogy, because it is so far cited in many ways. I mentioned the difficulty in choosing just one theme. It has multiple different themes, perennial themes, and he transformed scientification, as it was called back then. We call it science fiction, because in his time, the aliens, the non-humans, were always the bad guys, the evil creatures and races that posed a threat to us humans. But Lewis thought, he turned it upside down, and he thought that isn't it more probable, or at least as probable, that we are the danger? We, with our original sin, pose the danger to other species who may not be fallen species like us. And so we carry in us, just like we did carry germs and sicknesses to other continents, we carry in us original sin, which we can then fur to other planets and wreak havoc among the native populations. And that is precisely what happens in these books.
That's a very interesting take, and I confess I have not read the space trilogy, but I think that's a wonderful thing to end on, and I think I may go start.
Wonderful.
Thank you everyone for coming. This lecture will be available on YouTube and on all the Davenant podcast platforms. If you have enjoyed this lecture and you want more from Dr. Lepojärvi, where can people find more of your lectures?
Well, you can go to my YouTube site, for example, or I have some lectures there on both Tolkien and Lewis, or you could turn to my academia.edu homepage, where I try to post most of my scholarship on C.S. Lewis and Tolkien.
Very good. This lecture will be on YouTube, and both of those links will be available in the comments. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Dr. Lepojärvi.
Thank you.